I've had a great week, and now we're back to break down some amazing fights taking place this weekend at UFC 327. I really hope you're going to be able to use the information in this video to make some extra cash this weekend, and hopefully by the time this video is done you'll feel a lot better about some of the bets that you're considering placing, or maybe pump the brakes, retreat a little bit if I bring up some things that perhaps you weren't thinking of. But either way, if you're watching this video, you are going to be in the top tier of bettors in the UFC, because you know what it's like. Most people that you know bet on sports, they're not going to sit and watch long form content like this to learn as much as they can about the fights taking place this weekend, so that they can place informed bets that give them a really good chance of making some cash. And Lord knows we all need to make more cash at the moment in these tough economic times. We're all working harder than ever for less. And so if you're here, you're definitely in that top tier of person that bets on sports, because you're not just diving in, you know, like most people where they put very little thought into the bets that they place. You're probably looking at Twitter and X posts. You're watching long form video like this where we go into a ton of detail on each matchup. You're probably watching other videos from people whose opinions you respect. So you're at that top tier, you're at that top level. But I'm also sure there are probably other things you prefer to be doing, right? Let's be real, watching breakdown videos of UFC fights, it's not the most entertaining thing you could be doing. I'm sure you'd prefer to play video games, you'd prefer to be watching movies, spending time with your friends and family, but you're here, you're dedicated, you're spending time watching me, watching other guys like me, because you're passionate about this sport, but you're also passionate about improving your life, making some cash, betting on sports, because it's a great way to be immune to economic stresses, right? You look at how the stock market moves, you look at how crypto moves, a lot of it is outside of your control because governments meddle in how these different things move. You know, investments, a lot of the investments you can make, very, very much outside of your control, and the safer investments take a very long time to earn a lot of money. Sports betting is one thing where, to some extent, you can control your own destiny. You can't control how teams and fighters that we bet on perform. However, you can have a lot of control over your decision making, your strategy, your mentality, your discipline. And if you find profitable strategies and you keep the time, if you keep placing plus EV bets, getting your money into strong positions, the profits will take care of themselves. And so I know why you're here. You're here to make some extra cash this weekend, hopefully every weekend. But times are tough right now, okay? And I'm sure there's a bunch of other things you'd prefer to be doing than watching me. After all, you're probably working harder than ever, getting paid less than ever. So why not outsource your UFC bets this weekend and your chances of making money to a guy like me by joining my live betting group, where, as you can see, over the last 10 years dating back to 2016, we've made a profit almost every month of the year on 67% of UFC events. So rather than spending hours every week watching content like this and putting a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of stress into what bets you're going to be placing, why not go hang out with your girl, hang out with your family and friends, go play some video games, watch some movies, join my live betting group, and just turn up on Saturday night knowing that you don't have to do any research, you don't have to put any thoughts into the bets that you're placing. You join my live betting group, I do everything for you, and you're going to make a profit almost every single month of the year. Furthermore, the membership fee you'll join, or the membership fee you will pay to join my live betting group will pay for itself over the long term. And this profit chart shows that, because over the last 10 years we've consistently made profits and made money a very high percentage of the time on both events and months. So if you watch every UFC event live, you want to earn some extra cash, and you want to save a bit of time not having to watch content like this every week to consider what bets you're going to place, if you don't want to do your own research, join my live betting group. It will pay for itself. You'll learn a lot. You'll make money at the same time. You'll absolutely love it. And as we work our way through researching each of the fights on this card, we're going to go into a lot of depth, and everything that I'm going to be sharing with you is based on what I've seen from each of these fighters in their past performances. So right now, when we break down each of these matchups, I'm going to tell you how both fighters match up stylistically based on past performances, and we also use this knowledge in live betting so that as the fight is playing out, I can think back to what I've seen both guys do in past performances to somewhat predict the future. If we know what Gamrot and Ribovics tend to do in the second and third round of fights, we can kind of work out a very high percentage of the time who's likely to win based on what they've done in the second and third round of fights in the past. So as the first round plays out, we can start to get a read on things, jump in, place a live bet, and that kind of way of doing things is what has enabled me to make so much money over such a long period of time, and what can also help you make a lot of money if you join my live betting group. I've been here for a very, very long time, and the reason why I've been here for a long time is because people that join my live betting group tend to stick with me for years. They love it, they get a lot of value from it, and you could too. And this fight between Gamrot and Ribovics, which we're going to start off on, is a great fight for live betting. It's kind of difficult for pre-fight betting for reasons I'll explain, and I'll show you with a little bit of footage. But from a live betting point of view, this is a pretty good one. And to be fair, we do tend to live bet Gamrot's fights frequently, just because most of Gamrot's fights do tend to go to decisions, and those generally are the kind of fights which are pretty good for live bettings. Obviously, fights that go to a decision, you've got longer, the fight plays out longer for you to jump in and snipe a good opportunity for you to put your cash. So, as with every fight that we break down, the odds are very important on this one. We've got Gamrot as a 1.52 favourite, which is minus 194 for an implied probability of 66%. And we've got Ribovics at 2.57, which is plus 157 for an implied probability of 39%. I'm also going to bring up a betting site so that we can go through the try and find some over-unders and that kind of thing in just a moment. So I'll bring that up in just a moment. So yeah, implied probabilities 66% versus 39% for Ribovics. So what is interesting about this matchup is that both guys are very strong in the area that the other is weak. And that makes for an interesting stylistic matchup between these two, because we all know Gamrot's biggest weakness is his cardio. Tends to slow down around about the 6 or 7 minute mark of every fight. And Ribovics has got amazing cardio and fights at a really high pace. So Gamrot has got this weakness of gassing out, and Ribovics is a cardio machine. So he's well positioned to exploit that. But Ribovics, at least from what we've seen from him, his takedown offense and ground game's not great. Obviously, Gamrot is a good offensive wrestler, great takedown entries, and fights also at a really high pace. Gamrot doesn't gas out in fights because he has bad cardio. Gamrot gasses out in fights because he exerts so much energy with his wrestling that he naturally just gets tired. So when we look at the stylistic matchup between these two, it is an interesting one, because both of them have passed the victory. Ribovics can make Gamrot fight at a crazy pace and tire him out, drag him into the second half of the fight and then outwork him. But Gamrot can also stick to Ribovics like glue, out-grapple him, smother him, take him down, beat him up on the ground and score points that way. And so, as we work through breaking this matchup down, this is one of the more interesting fights on this card. Very difficult to predict who's going to win pre-fight. I'll show you a little bit of footage so you can see why. But this is an amazing fight for live betting, because we know exactly how both guys perform, what their strengths and weaknesses are. So as the fight's playing out, we should be able to snipe a strong position on this one. In terms of the tail of the tape, there's not a whole lot going on. In terms of the stats, there's not a whole lot to really help us here. You can see that both guys are around about the same size. You can see Gamrot's 6 years older, but I don't think it means much in the context of this matchup. And when it comes to the actual performance stats, again, it doesn't really tell us anything that we don't already know. The striking stats mostly favour Ribovics. He lands more than double the amount of strikes per minute than Gamrot. And then the grappling stats favour Gamrot, where he shoots far more takedowns per round, and his takedown offense is also a lot better as well. So if we look at how these two really match up from a stylistic point of view, The reason why this is such a difficult fight to predict before a punch is thrown from a pre-fight betting point of view is because it's been a really long time since we saw Ribovics face a grappler. So as it stands in 2026, we don't really know what his takedown defense is like. It shows here that he defended 9 of 9 takedowns against Elvis Brenner. But if you go back and watch that fight, Brenner was gassed out after 1 round. We know Brenner's not a particularly good offensive wrestler either, and he didn't really commit to those takedowns. So that doesn't really tell us a whole lot. Against Zellhuber, he defended 1 takedown, great, but again, Zellhuber is a Mexican kickboxer. And then in his UFC debut, the takedown defended stat isn't generating here for some reason, but his takedown offense looked absolutely dreadful against Radzhabov, and I'm going to show you some footage of this fight so that you can see it for yourself, because I know there's a lot of interest in this matchup. So if you are thinking of betting Ribovics this weekend, I know some of you watching this will be, you definitely need to watch the Radzhabov fight because it is red flag city. So the reason why this is such a difficult fight to bet pre-fight is that Kamela Kirk's a striker. This fight only lasted 37 seconds. Zellhuber's a striker. Hakaras a striker. Brenner's a striker as well. So we've only really seen Ribovics fight 1 grappler in the UFC, and that was over 3 years ago now. And so whilst Ribovics' takedown offense and ground game looked terrible against Radzhabov, obviously, he could have improved a lot in the last 3 years, and, maybe a lot more difficult to take down and hold down now. But the problem is, all we can do is make the best decision possible with the information we've got available. Based on the information we've got available, to be fair, it looks like a relatively easy fight for Gamrot. I don't know if Gamrot will ever have an easy fight with how bad his cardio is, but it's certainly a good stylistic matchup for him. So before we go any further, we really need to show you this Radzhabov-Ribovics fight. And again, Ribovics looks terrible here, but there's a couple of reasons, and there's a couple of reasons why we shouldn't put too much weight on this footage. There you go, he goes down easily there. The first reason being, like I say, it was over 3 years ago. Ribovics would only have been 26 years old back when this fight took place, so he's likely made big improvements since then. On top of that, Ribovics was making his UFC debut against Radzhabov, and that guys often underperform in their debut, but he gave up a cheap takedown there, right at the beginning of the fight, and then you'll see here he gives up another takedown here. Radzhabov commits hard to a single leg, switches to a double leg, and he gets it. Now, what you notice throughout this matchup is that Ribovics does do a reasonably good job of working his way back up to his feet each time that he gets taken down, but he does get taken down very easily, and Gamrot is a better offensive wrestler than Radzhabov. A big mistake that Ribovics makes in this fight is that he keeps using these kind of kimuras to try and hit reversals and work his way back up to his feet. But that is very unlikely to work against a grappler as good as Gamrot, and so I'm sure he's improved that. I'm sure he's tightened that up now over the last 3 years, but it's something that stands out in this matchup, how he keeps falling in love with these kimuras, and as a result gives up position a lot, ends up on the bottom a lot, and gets taken down a lot, and actually gets held down a lot more than he should. So we're still only 2.5 minutes into this fight, and then you can see Radzhabov drives into a double leg, takes him down again. So there's 2 minutes 13 on the clock here. If we just skim through, you can see Radzhabov just kind of sticks to him like glue. Beats him up from top position, all that kind of stuff. Just going to skip through. He's been on the ground for about a minute at this point. And eventually he's back up again. He falls in love with this kimura. What he should be doing there is fighting for underhooks, but instead he fights for a kimura, and that enables Radzhabov to just pick him up, put him back on the ground. So I haven't been keeping count, but it feels like Ribovics has been taken down about 5 times in this first round alone. And yes, he does a good job of defending himself, and for the most part popping back up relatively quickly like that. But if you're using decent takedown defense in the first place, you wouldn't have to be exerting so much energy to get back up. Right at the beginning of the second round, Ribovics taken down again, gets back up, And then Radzhabov gets the body lock, hits an outside trip, gets taken down again. That's got to be 7 or 8 takedowns at this point. And then I'm just going to skip through so the breakdown doesn't turn out to be very long. Ribovics gets back up. Very, very nice. But again, Gamrot, better MMA grappler than Radzhabov. Now as we go through, Radzhabov does start to get more tired, so the takedowns become less frequent, but he jumps on a double leg there, connects his hands together, and there's only one way this is going to end. Reaps Ribovics' legs out from underneath him, gets takedown again. Credit the Ribovics, pops back up pretty quickly. But again, shortly after, gets taken down again. Radzhabov keeps that single leg, turns the corner, gets him down. Again, Ribovics back up pretty quick. But his takedown offense looks absolutely dreadful. A minute later, good boxing. You can see, we're right at the end of round 2. And Ribovics is still fresh. But Ribovics' takedown offense just lets him down. Time after time after time. Just keeps letting him down. You see how close he keeps his legs together up against the cage. Makes him so easy to take down. Now into the 3rd round. And Radzhabov is clearly very, very tired at this point in the fight. Oh no. How's my fight pass lagged out? Ooh. My internet gone down. Yesterday, when I was breaking down the fight between Gamrot and Ribovics, my internet connection in my house cut out. So I didn't manage to finish showing you the 3rd round of the Ribovics versus Radzhabov fight, but I think I showed you enough footage to highlight how bad Ribovics' takedown defense and ground game is. So we're going to wrap this one up now, and as you can probably tell from the things that I've said in this breakdown already, this is a really difficult fight from a betting point of view, because there's no way that you would want to be betting Ribovics against a strong MMA grappler like Gamrot with great offensive wrestling when Ribovics' takedown offense and ground game looks as bad as what we've just seen in that Radzhabov fight. It's a real shame that we haven't seen him face any grapplers since, because the likelihood, a young guy like Ribovics, who only would have been about 26 years old when he fought Radzhabov, the likelihood is that he has improved his takedown offense a lot, and if he has, he could cause Gamrot big problems. But we're not gambling on this channel. We're just trying to get our money into strong positions where it makes sense to bet a fighter based on us finding value versus the implied probability. And based on that takedown offense, it just becomes impossible to bet Ribovics. If you do bet Ribovics this weekend, you are totally gambling on whether or not his takedown offense has improved enough to neutralize the threat of Gamrot's wrestling. And to be fair to you, it would it would have to improve a hell of a lot to neutralize the threat of Gamrot's wrestling. On the flip side though, because there's a reasonably good chance that Ribovics has meaningfully improved his takedown defense and ground game in the last 3 years, it's also incredibly risky to bet Gamrot at an implied probability of 66%, because to get any value on him at all, you'd have to be giving him like a 70% chance of winning or better, which is very difficult to do. It basically means Gamrot really doesn't have any legitimate way of losing outside of something crazy happening, which we can't predict. Like 70% is a very, very high probability. It's a high bar for you to meet if you want to bet Gamrot this weekend. I think it's very difficult to justify giving Gamrot a 70% chance of winning this. So from a pre-fight betting point of view, there's not a lot we can do here. The odds are probably where they should be. Gamrot's, decently steep favourite odds reflect the advantages he has based on past performances. But I do think Ribovics will likely look a lot better than he did against Radzhabov. So from my perspective, there's 2 ways that this fight is going to go. You will either see Gamrot stick to Ribovics like glue, wet blanket him, repeatedly take him down, control him up against the cage, control him on the ground. I mean, we know Gamrot doesn't have the best grappling control. He's not the most physically imposing grappler. And we know Ribovics is very good at popping back up to his feet. So I think you'll see Gamrot do what he does in a lot of fights, where he spams takedowns and he gets Ribovics down a lot, and he's able to smother Ribovics with his MMA grappling, which makes it difficult for Ribovics to spend time in the middle of the octagon where he can score points with his boxing. And I think based on past performances, Gamrot's likely got good enough cardio to do that for the first 2 rounds and put the first 2 rounds in the bank, and then kind of just coast and stay alive in the 3rd round like he often does to win a 29-28 decision. I think that's the most likely outcome. I think the other possibility, and where this fight becomes interesting from a live betting point of view, is that if Ribovics has notably improved his takedown offense, which is possible, we could see a situation where Gamrot has tons of success in the first 2 rounds, wet blanketing Ribovics, but rather than Gamrot easily getting Ribovics down and controlling him and running that clock down and putting, a dominant, decisive first 2 rounds in the bank, you could see a situation where instead Ribovics' takedown offense has improved to that level where he could make Gamrot work far harder for takedowns than we anticipate he's going to be able to based on the Radzhabov performance. And instead, like we've seen, in like the Dan Hooker fight as a great example, certainly the Charles Oliveira fight, rather than Gamrot slowing, late in round 2 and then being able to coast in the 3rd, perhaps if Ribovics can make him work really hard and Gamrot starts to slow after like the 6 or 7 minute mark, then that gives Ribovics the opportunity to finish round 2 strong, nick round 2, and then maybe backdoor a 29-28 decision. I'm pretty confident Gamrot is going to win round 1, and I'm pretty confident Ribovics is going to win round 3. Round 2 is that swing round, and who wins it is going to come down to how well Gamrot's cardio holds up. Based on past performances, I think he will be tired in round 2, but I think he'll still have enough to like wet blanket and smother Ribovics in pressure. But we haven't seen Ribovics face a wrestler for 3 years, and a lot can change in 3 years. So we'll have to see how it goes. Goes without saying that Ribovics has got a big advantage on the feet. So before we wrap this one up, let's run through. Let us run through the over/under and see if we can dig up anything on the fight spread. Where are we? Okay, here we go. So I actually do like plus 3.5 Ribovics. I'd be surprised if Gamrot were able to win all 3 rounds. We know that Gamrot gets very tired, so I think it's super likely Ribovics is able to weaponize his cardio and win that 3rd round. So plus 3.5. The odds aren't amazing, but I'll probably take a little shot on that. And then in terms of the over-under, I think it's very likely this fight goes to a decision. If we take a look at the records of both guys, you can see that Ribovics is a bit of a decisionator. He's gone to a decision in 5 of his last 6 fights. It's going to be something similar with Gamrot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of his last 7. So yeah, I do like the over, but the odds are very steep. At an implied probability of 1.40. If we bring the calculator up, you're going to be looking at, an implied probability is going to be about 70%. Yeah, 71.43. So, yeah, very difficult to make money betting that. And I think now it's time we move on to breaking down the next fight between Cub Swanson and Nate Landwehr. With both guys in the even money odds range, if you shop around, you can bet both of them pretty much at the same odds. In that 50-50 implied probability odds range, which means if you can give one of these guys, a 60% chance of winning, you haven't got a super confident bet on your hands, but you do have a nice plus EV bet on your hands. So our objective for breaking this fight down, and our objective in research, is trying to identify which way is better to lean. What's the more intelligent lean on this fight? And if you can just lean one way or the other in this even money odds range, you've probably got a bet on your hands. So if we look at the fighter comparison tool, obviously this is a young man's game, and both these guys are old and very much on a steep decline. And I'm allowed to say they're old because I'm 41 years old, so Cub Swanson at 42. I'm allowed to call him old because I'm basically calling myself old as well. Notably, 42 years old and 37 years old for Landwehr is ancient for the featherweight division. So the lighter weight classes are all about speed, reflexes, athleticism, and we see fighters in the lighter weight classes decline much earlier than in the heavier weight classes. So these guys are seriously old for the division now, and that is going to be kind of a running theme that we're going to come back to as we break down how these two match up from a stylistic point of view. They're about the same size though, which is a bit of a surprise because Swanson's always been kind of small for the division. I would have thought Landwehr would have had a bigger size advantage than this, but he doesn't really. In terms of the stats on this one, I think this is one of those fights where we need to be a bit smart in how we interpret these stats, because obviously Cub has fought a much higher level of opponent throughout his UFC career than Landwehr, and as a result his averages are going to be lower just because he's fought a much higher level of opponent. So where these stats are cumulative over Cub's career, his averages are naturally going to drop relative to Landwehr's stats. So it does show us the Landwehr lands 17.5% more strikes per minute, but he likely wouldn't land more strikes than Cub per minute had he fought the same level of competition as Cub. We can see Cub's better defensively. That's not a particularly big surprise. He's also more accurate. And the reason why I say these stats are not a surprise is because Landwehr is obviously quite slow, quite bad defensively, and quite reckless as well. Whereas Cub's more of a technician with great footwork, great movement. He's great at getting in and out without getting hit, or at least he was. He's still not bad at 42, but obviously he's not prime Cub anymore. Father Time is the only one in mixed martial arts who's undefeated. I can't think of anyone else that retires undefeated, apart from Mr. Khabib. So in terms of grappling, I don't think we're going to see much grappling in this one, but you can see Landwehr has the better takedown offense. Both guys shoot about one takedown per 15 minutes on average. But again, this stat for Landwehr is very misleading. So his takedown offense at 72% looks decent, but there are actually issues with his ground game that we'll talk about. Not that I think it'll matter, but we'll go into it anyway, just in case. So obviously the big issue with these two is their age, and whenever you bet on fighters at this stage in their career, you are taking a big gamble, because they've taken a lot of damage throughout their careers. They've had a lot of injuries. They're not going to be as durable as they used to be, but above all else, they're not going to be as motivated. They're not going to be as hungry. They're not going to have that same fire in the belly. By the time you reach this stage in your career, you're probably focusing on other businesses, other interests, and that makes it very difficult to continue to compete at the highest level of the sport, because you've got to be all in, right? You don't see like Lionel Messi setting up football gyms and setting up burger chains and promoting affiliate products online. When he was in his prime at Barcelona, he's all in, he's dedicated to his craft, and he's just working hard every day to get better. By the time you get to these guys' age, that changes, and we see Cub running his own gym. We see him cornering fighters regularly in the UFC. Not sure what Landwehr is doing. He's a bit crazy. Perhaps he is still all in. He does strike me as the kind of guy that probably still thinks he's the best in the world. But with that being said, he's not going to be as motivated at 37 as he was at 27. And so you can't really say, both these guys are old, so it'll kind of that kind of risk factor kind of cancels out, because it's an issue for both of them. And I think that's a dangerous game to play, because ultimately what that means is that if you bet either of these, you are accepting that you're betting on inconsistent fighters. So if the core principle of what we do is trying to predict the probability either fighter has of winning, and we can see currently the implied probability on both guys is close to 50-50, if we accept that at this stage in their careers they're going to be inconsistent for many reasons we've just discussed, how can you reasonably cap either of these guys better than 50%? Because you don't really know what version of them's going to show up because of their inconsistency at this stage in their careers. The fact that if we look at Cub in particular, we haven't seen him in 2 years, since December 2024, and so who knows how Cub is going to look. 2 years is a long time at this stage in his career, We've seen Landwehr more recently against Morgan Charrier about this time last year, but even a year ago, a year is a long time at 37 years old in the featherweight division. So who knows what to expect from these two? It just becomes a bit of a minefield betting this fight. Now, in terms of how they match up stylistically, all we can really do with a fight like this is try and make the best decision possible with the information we've got available based on past performances, and accept that the version of these two that we get this weekend, there's a good chance it's going to be very different from what we've seen in the past. Now, straight up, I would lean towards Nate Landwehr in this fight for a few reasons. The first being, Cubs coming in on a long layoff. And at 42 years old, you can significantly decline in a very short space of time. Now, I know we haven't seen Landwehr for about a year, but at least we've seen him a lot more recently than we've seen Cub. I say a lot more recently, 8 months. But 8 months, again, at this stage in their careers, it's a big deal. And against Morgan Charrier, he didn't look totally shot, to be fair. And his cardio held up pretty well. So those are two things that perhaps we don't have to be crazy concerned about this weekend. When you look at Cub Swanson's recent fights against Billy Quarantillo and also Andre Fili, he did slow down quite a lot in both fights. Now, I know you're probably watching this thinking, well, how could Cub possibly have slowed down against Quarantillo if he had the energy to get a third round finish? If you go back and watch that fight, by the second half of the matchup, he was looking very slow, flat, quite tired. And if you take a direct comparison between Cub's fight against Quarantillo and Landwehr's fight against Charrier, and we should put a lot of emphasis on both those matchups because you're only as good as your last fight, and those most recent fights give us the best indicator of what to expect from them this weekend, then I would say certainly Landwehr's cardio held up a hell of a lot better than Cub's did. And that's a big factor at this stage in their careers, because at 42 years old, very far into the future from December 2024, Cubs' cardio is likely looking a lot worse now than it did back then. And so, yeah, this is one of those fights where whilst I understand why someone would favour Cub, he is the more technical striker. Landwehr is very bad defensively. From my perspective, Cub's never been a big puncher. Even in his prime, he was more of a volume striker. Like, if you look at his wins, third round, this almost went to a decision here. I mean, Darren Elkins is Darren Elkins, right? But then you've got decision, and then you look at him in his prime, decision. So Cub's always been more of a volume striker, is the point I'm trying to make. And yes, Landwehr is bad defensively, but he is a tough fucker as well. And I just think if both these guys are going to stand and bang for 3 rounds, which is the most likely outcome here, I'd much prefer to have my money on the younger, more durable fighter with the proven better gas tank. I can't call Landwehr more durable, forget I said that, but Landwehr is certainly the younger fighter with the better cardio, and from the surface at least, less external distractions. I know Cub's working on a lot of businesses. He's a smart, intelligent, ambitious guy. His wife is also a public figure. Landwehr, I think, is more likely to be more all in on this fight than Cub. And also, I don't think I don't think this is going to be a retirement fight for Landwehr. I think it's quite likely this is a retirement fight for Cub at 42. So yeah, I do lean towards Landwehr in this one. Not with any amount of confidence. It would be a fool's errand to be confident on fighters at this stage in their careers, but there's more reasons to like Landwehr than there are Swanson. So if we take a look at the fight spreads on this one, again, Landwehr plus 3.5, looking pretty good. I'd be surprised if I'd be surprised if the fight spread didn't win. I think the only reason why the fight spread wouldn't win would be if Cub knocked him out, which is possible, but like I say, Cub's never really been a power puncher. I do think it's quite likely this will go over, but again, I think that it would be foolish to bet an over on a fight between a 42-year-old and a 37-year-old in the featherweight division. I haven't actually mentioned about the grappling. Just I don't think there'll be any grappling in this one. But if there were to be grappling in this one, Cub would have a huge advantage. Cub is a better MMA grappler, better at working his way back up to his feet. Landwehr, even though the stat says 72% takedown defense, he's quite easy to take down. And the issue with Landwehr is that he's very weak off his back and easy to hold down. So, yeah, hope you found that breakdown useful. If you did, please hit the like button below. And subscribe if you want me to keep doing these videos. They do take a lot of work. And better still, if you want to help keep the channel going, head on over to my website, join the live betting group, and yeah, you'll absolutely love it. And hopefully you can come join the team and we can use all this research to make a bit of money on Saturday night in live betting. I'm very confident that we will. So I think it's time we move on to the next one. Now let's break down the fight between Azamat Murzakanov and Paulo Costa. So I'm finding it difficult to find bets that I really like on this card. I think it's been a good year for pre-fight betting so far. Much generous odds than we've had in recent years. But I think with this being a big pay-per-view, there's more eyeballs on it. And I think we're seeing that in the pre-fight betting lines where the odds are quite accurate, in my opinion. There's like a few fights at the moment which are appealing to me from a betting point, like pre-fight betting point of view, but there's no one I really love pre-fight yet. There's just a bunch of fighters like Paulo Costa who are interesting to me, but if I were to bet Paulo Costa this weekend, I wouldn't be betting him based on me thinking he's more likely to win. I would just simply be playing the odds. Because if we look at the odds on this one, Murzakanov's a 1.49 minus 206 favourite at an implied probability of 67%. And Costa's a 2.66 underdog, which is plus 166 for an implied probability of 38%. If I were capping this fight personally, I would probably have it closer to 50-50. I don't really know why Murzakanov is such a big favourite. I think it's probably recency bias where, you know, he's had some big wins recently. You know, the win over Rakic was a big win. He's like that hot, shiny new thing in the division. Whereas Costa, been around the block a bit, doesn't have as much hype behind him right now. But when you strip all that nonsense away and just focus on how both of them match up stylistically, I don't see major advantages here for either guy. And that's why I would lean towards Costa, because obviously, if I think this is going to be a relatively close fight, there's no way I would bet Murzakanov at an implied probability of 67%. I prefer to have the underdog at 38%, but it doesn't mean I'm particularly confident Costa will win. So, in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, I think this fight's very likely going to come down to cardio. And whilst there have been situations in Costa's career where he has slowed, I do think he has the better cardio out of the two. Murzakanov is a guy that does tend to start really strong, does look great in the first round, but if you can kind of survive till like the 7 or 8 minute mark, he fades very hard past that point. And so it's very difficult to win the early rounds against Murzakanov, but if you hang in there, he's very beatable. So I wouldn't expect to see any grappling in this match. It's very rare that either of these guys try to take the other down. And so if we evaluate how they match up when it comes to striking, Murzakanov is the better boxer out of the two, and he's got more raw power in his hands, whereas Costa is the more complete striker and has the better gas tank. And that's really how both these two match up. So what you're likely to see in the first round is Murzakanov having, you know, a good amount of success with his boxing and outboxing Costa, and Costa's biggest success is likely going to be with his leg and body kicks. Costa's got, you know, a great inside leg kick, and he's really good at chipping away at you with hard, impactful, damaging kicks from a distance where it's very difficult for you to counter him unless you come forward, cover a lot of distance, and let your hands go, which Murzakanov is the exact kind of guy that will do that. So early on, I think you'll see Costa chipping away at Murzakanov with hard kicks. Murzakanov, firing back with big power strikes. And yeah, I think this fight's going to come down to cardio. At what point Murzakanov in the fight slows, and whether Costa's got enough in the tank to be able to make him pay for slowing. It's tricky to say if he will, because Costa also slows. So, I understand why Murzakanov is the favourite to some extent. He is likely to start much better. He is the better boxer out of the two. He does have more power. For me, these odds are just very aggressive. If it were me, I would probably have Murzakanov about 1.7, which I believe is minus 140. Yeah, about I would lean more like 60-40 in favour of Murzakanov than these quite aggressive odds, in my opinion, which is putting Murzakanov up in that 70% implied probability range. I do think the odds are a little off, but not a massive amount. And because pre-fight betting is so difficult in 2026, I think in order to be profitable long term these days, when you're placing bets, you do need a nice fat chunky margin, just to account for the inevitable long stretches of brutal variance you're going to go through whenever you're placing bets on a sport like, I can't really call the UFC a sport, but when you're betting something like the UFC, where you're dealing with naturally a very low volume of bets, because you only get 12 to 14 fights per week to bet. So I think a way you can counteract that is only placing bets with loads of value, and it's not very often you get situations with loads of value. So personally, I think Paulo Costa's the better bet here, but I wouldn't predict him to win with any amount of confidence. Both guys are gassy, they both slow down, but it's a great fight. In terms of the over-under and the fight spreads, I don't know why it keeps taking me back to the home page, but let's have a look. What do we have? Where are we? Okay, so Costa plus 3.5. That's in 1.86 even money odds range. That's quite interesting to me. I wouldn't touch the over/under on this one just because both guys slow down a lot. But gun to my head, I do think this fight's more likely to go to a decision. If you take a look at Costa's record, he is a tough fucker. He's been to a decision in his last 6 and 7 of his last 8. He's not an easy guy to put away. 6 of his last 7, sorry. Not an easy guy to put away. If we look at Murzakanov's record, he's got finishes in his last 3. He does have a lot of finishes, to be fair. But Costa's tough. He's durable. He's been the distance with heavy hitters, like Whitaker, Romero in his prime. Uriah Hall back in 2018 wasn't much fun to stand in front of for 3 rounds. Can't remember if November 2017 would have been. This would have been after USADA, so a win over Johnny Hendricks, not quite as impressive. Ola Whale Bang Bose back in the day was pretty dangerous on the feet as well. So yeah, I think this one's more likely to go to a decision. So I hope you found that useful. Let's move on to the next fight. Now let's break down the fight between Dominick Reyes and Johnny Walker. Another matchup in the even money odds range, which is great for us. We can see Reyes is a 1.68 favourite, which is minus 146 for an implied probability of 59%. And we can see that Walker's a 2.19 underdog, which is plus 118 for an implied probability of 46%. So, roughly 60-40 in Reyes' favour. If we take a look at the fighter comparison tool, we can see that they're both about the same age, but Walker does have a notable size and series of reach advantages. 2 inches taller, 5-inch longer reach, and a 1-inch longer leg reach. And of course, all these different size advantages for Walker do compound. In terms of the stats, you can see Reyes lands about 50% more strikes per minute. Probably those really passive, tentative performances from Walker where he didn't really do a lot against guys like Thiago Santos, probably hurting that average. They're both about the same when it comes to accuracy. Reyes better defensively, but that's probably counteracted by the fact that Walker's going to be a lot more durable. And you don't very often see much grappling from these two. And I wouldn't expect to see much grappling in this one either. Reyes very difficult to take down. Walker's takedown offensive ground game worse than Reyes. if this fight were to go to the ground, which I don't think it will, but if it did, Reyes would have an advantage there. So in terms of how both these two match up from a stylistic point of view, Reyes lands a higher volume of strikes. He's the more technical striker out of the two. Walker, on the other hand, throws a lower volume, but what he does throw can kill you. Obviously, he's got a lot of power in his hands. And so I think this is one of those fights where you're either going to see Reyes win a decision or Walker win by knockout inside the distance. And I don't see a whole lot of other outcomes, if I'm honest. Yeah, this fight is a tricky one for pre-fight betting because it's difficult to trust either of them. With how powerful and dangerous Walker is, and with how chinny Reyes appears to be at this stage in his career, knocked out by Ulberg, knocked out by Span, knocked out by Procházka, knocked out by Blaydes, it's difficult to see him standing in front of Walker for 3 rounds without getting himself knocked out. So for that reason, Walker is probably my lean on this one, but not with any amount of confidence, as I don't rate Walker particularly highly. If we take a look at the over-under on this one and the fight spread, I wouldn't touch fight spreads on this one just because I think it's unlikely to go to a decision. The over-under is set at over 1.5 rounds on this. I would leave that. Yeah, I don't see any opportunities for betting that. This fight is an easy pass for me. I think it's better if we move on and break down a better fight for betting. Now let's break down the next fight, which is going to be Curtis Blaydes versus the new king of cringe, Josh Hokit. And again, we've got an opportunity to bet both guys in the even money odds range. So Blaydes 1.79 favourite, which is minus 126 for an implied probability of 56%, and Hokit 2.03 underdog, which is plus 103 for an implied probability of 49%. So very difficult fight for pre-fight betting if you're trying to make a decision based on what we know, because when it comes to Josh Hokit, he is pretty much a total, complete unknown. We just don't know anything about him. So even though he finds himself in a co-main event this weekend and he's getting a lot of media attention, the fact is that he's been fast-tracked into a matchup like this really quick before we've learned anything about him. So if you hear anyone talking confidently about what to expect from Hokit this weekend, run a mile, because if you've done your homework on this guy, his past fights don't really tell us much. They tell us what he likes to do, they tell us what he's good at, but they don't tell us anything about potential weaknesses that could be lurking. So if you take a look at his record, the reason why this is such a difficult fight for pre-fight betting is because the Denzel Freeman fight ended in 5 minutes. The Jimenez fight ended in a minute. This one ended early in round 2. This one ended in 2 minutes. This one ended in 42 seconds. This one 2 minutes 53. This one 5 minutes. And this one went deep, but it was 3 years ago now against a relatively low level of opponent. So the problem with these fights are, first of all, most of them ended extremely quickly, which means we don't really know how Hokit is going to look if this fight goes into the 2nd and 3rd round, and heavyweights commonly slow down a lot as fights wear on. The second reason why Hokit's performances are difficult to evaluate is because they've both been against a very low level of opponent, and Hokit is quite good at what he does. So Hokit is, an MMA grappler. He doesn't really spend too much time striking. As soon as the fight starts, he comes out, looks to wet blanket and wrestle his opponents. And he's looked very good at that because, he's fought low-level opponents who aren't very good wrestlers. Now, the UFC have given him, a matchup against what is probably the best MMA grappler in the division if you take John Jones out of the equation. And so that's really problematic for Hokit because his striking doesn't look particularly good. There's a real flatness to him on the feet. And even though his MMA grappling has looked good, is it going to be good enough to take on probably the best MMA grappler in the heavyweight division right now? The best active MMA. I can't think of a better active MMA grappler than Curtis Blaydes. And so, very, very brutal matchmaking, actually. And I can't help but feel that with Hokit's kind of WWE nonsense, I can't help but feel that the UFC brass have potentially given him the worst stylistic matchup imaginable, because they find him a bit cringe and a bit annoying, and they find that he devalues the brand a bit. I mean, if you're trying to sell a big pay-per-view this weekend, you know, do you want someone who is professional but charismatic, who people are drawn to, that people find entertaining and interesting, or would you want a fighter like Hokit that is doing like the cringiest, fakest, like you're trying to be a professional sport? I understand Hokit understands that UFC fighters don't get paid anything, so he's perhaps trying to use the UFC as a platform to forge a career in professional wrestling. But I don't think the UFC brass are going to be a whole lot happy with him and his approach to promoting fights. In his defense, it probably will work. The sport's quite boring these days. There aren't many big stars, so when you do get someone like Hokit come along that offers something a little bit different, he will capture people's attention. That's an inevitability. And I think it's good for Hokit what he's doing, but I think there's probably a reason why he's been matched up with Curtis Blaydes. I don't think the UFC brass are probably a fan of him, and I think as a result they're giving him a fight which is going to probably be a stylistic nightmare. And so when we consider what that means from a betting point of view, the odds make this a very interesting fight, because I always say let the odds do the work for you, right? So my perspective on this matchup is this. Hokit is pretty much an unknown. He could be the greatest heavyweight of all time. He could about to be fraud checked in a major way on Saturday night, and anything in between, right? He could end up being, you know, a decent level top 5, top 10 heavyweight and cause guys problems. Even if he loses against Blaydes, he could still be a top heavyweight, right? Blaydes has been fishing around that top 5 for probably the last 5 years. But we don't know. Hokit could be very good, might not be very good. We have no idea. He's a total unknown, and anyone that tells you otherwise, they're lying to you, because the footage doesn't exist unless you're watching Hokit having secret incredible sparring matches against the best heavyweights in the world. No one knows how good Hokit is. Facts. Not even Hokit knows how good he is, or his coaches know how good he is, because he hasn't proven himself against the best yet, or against anyone in the top 15 for that matter. So the way I would look at this fight is, if we consider what Blaydes' biggest weakness is, well, it's his striking defense, right? Blaydes has got a habit of, getting into big exchanges against scary heavyweights and getting himself knocked out before he has a chance to go to his wrestling. That's Blaydes' biggest weakness. But if you look at Hokit's past performances, what they do show us is that there is a real flatness to his striking. He doesn't really have much power in his hands. It doesn't mean he can't knock Blaydes out. The UFC is crazy and chaotic and unpredictable. If it was predictable, we'd all be millionaires. It's chaos, right? It's one of the reasons why we like it. You can tune in every Saturday night and you can see humans achieve great things and have major moments of real life drama. It's great. But generally speaking, based on past performances, Hokit looks quite flat on the feet, doesn't have much power. And that, to some extent, makes sense. We know a lot of guys that, push a very high pace when it comes to grappling, don't have much power in their hands. It's normal, right? If you think about like the Merab Dvalishvilis that are these cardio machines, the trade-off for that cardio is they don't have that raw power that guys like a Yoel Romero or a Hector Lombard would have, but then they would have to trade that raw power and athleticism for not having the best cardio. So Hokit seems like he's in the cardio camp with Curtis Blaydes, to be fair. So Blaydes got this big weakness. He's reckless and he's chinny on the feet, but I don't think Hokit is that well positioned to exploit that weakness. And so if both these guys, if we consider that both these guys are MMA grapplers And we know for a fact Curtis Blaydes is either the best MMA grappler currently in the heavyweight division, or he's certainly top 2. I can't think of a third fighter I would put him below. If you can think of any fighters who are better MMA grapplers than Blaydes in the heavyweight division right now, please let me know. I mean, maybe you can cook up an unproven guy like Hokit from Dagestan or something that's only had 1 or 2 fights in the heavyweight division. But in terms of like established heavyweights, I can't think of a better MMA grappler than Blaydes right now in the heavyweight division, of course. And so, what are the chances that Hokit, 8-0, having never even fought anyone in the top 20 of the UFC's heavyweight division, what are the odds that he's going to come in and out-grapple Curtis Blaydes in his second fight in the UFC, third fight in the UFC? What are the chances? I don't think they're very high, are they? And so by default, if you have a brain and you have eyes, you kind of have to lean Blaydes pretty heavily here. Now, his implied probability is 56%, right? 55.8%. It's 56%. Now, if you can lean, 60-40, in one direction. Well, no, that's not true with Hokit's case. But if you can give Blaydes a 60% chance of winning here, a little margin of value there, a little bet on your hands. And I think it's fair to cap Blaydes at 60%. And not because I think Blaydes is particularly likely to win. I don't feel super confident in Blaydes. I can't come here and say, these are all the advantages Blaydes has got over Hokit. I can't say any of those things because we don't know anything about Hokit. But what I do know by default, when you consider everything, when you weigh everything up, this is a huge step up in competition for Hokit. And if he can't out-grapple Blaydes, which he might not be able to, not many guys have ever been able to, this could be a tough night for Hokit. And on top of that, I will also say this. This is just anecdotal. But people talk about sports betting in absolutes. Almost like they think they're betting on robots. Right? And when, a fighter underperforms and they lose a fight, they talk in absolutes in terms of that's how things always would have gone, and anyone should have known that, and anyone should have seen it, and it was so obvious. And you see it with football matches and baseball and basketball and anything else. Most people view sports through a very linear lens, and they don't understand that we're all very deep individuals with a lot going on in our heads, and pressure, performance anxiety, the stresses of just being alive, it all impacts our ability to perform on a day-to-day basis. Like, whatever you do for a living, you must know that every day you perform at a different level, right? There are some days where you're super motivated, you've got loads of energy, and you're in that flow state and you just do an amazing day's work. And then other days you can't get your head in the game, you don't feel motivated, and you don't get much done just because you feel lethargic and you don't have that energy. It's so foolish that people don't consider this to be a huge contributing factor to why so many athletes in every sport underperform. And one of the biggest determining factors, or biggest contributing factors to a fighter underperforming, is pressure and performance anxiety. It is so difficult to perform optimally when you're under a lot of stress and pressure. And I can speak to this myself. Throughout my career, I've suffered with crippling performance anxiety, and I still do to this day. I still get nervous before I live bet, UFC events. It never goes away. And unless you're a complete psychopath, I don't think it ever will go away. And I think this is why fighters like John Jones and Conor McGregor reached the highest heights of the sport, because these were two guys that could manage that pressure and performance anxiety. They were able to just deal with it and turn up on fight night unfazed and perform to their full potential. But the best example of, confidence being a massive factor in how you perform and showing the importance of taking performance anxiety and pressure very seriously. I think one of the best examples we've got is Ronda Rousey. You know, if you look at the career trajectory of Ronda Rousey, at one point not that long ago, she was the biggest star in mixed martial arts by a mile. You know, it's her and Conor in their own universe, and then everyone else miles below them. We've never had stars like Ronda and Conor before. And if you look at Ronda's career, when she was on the come up, you know, from Strikeforce coming into the UFC, she would just destroy everyone. She would slam girls on their head, armbar them in, you know, 10, 15, 20 seconds. And she looked unbeatable. And when you saw her in press conferences and at weigh-ins and stare-downs, she was confident, she was charismatic, she was cocky. You know, she would radiate that confidence. She would look invincible, and she would be great in interviews. And then, as soon as she took that first loss against Holly Holm, it was like she lost all her aura. She lost that glow. She lost her confidence, and she was never the same again. And after losing to Holly Holm, she's never won a fight since. Never performed well since. Not only has she not won, she hasn't performed well since. I'm sure that'll change against Gina Carano. I'm sure she's got some wins in the WWE. But, you know, Ronda before and after her first loss, completely different beast. Completely different person. That comes down to performance anxiety, pressure and stress. Ronda would have suffered crippling performance anxiety after her first loss to get her title back, to get her career back on track. And all that mind talk makes it much harder for her to perform optimally like she did, that enabled her to get her to the dance and go on that huge winning run and become, you know, one of the biggest stars we've ever had in this sport. Why is this relevant? Why am I going off on this huge tangent? Well, reason why that, you know, Ronda's story, Conor's story, John Jones's story is very relevant to a fight like this is because those fighters are unicorns. Reason why Conor and Ronda and John Jones are massive stars in the sport is because it's extremely rare that fighters can manage the level of performance anxiety and pressure that comes with being at the very top of something for a long period of time. It's extremely rare. Cristiano Ronaldo's, the Kobe Bryants, the Lionel Messi's, you know, the Tyson Furies, they're just a rare breed. They have superhuman mental strength to drown out all the noise and just focus on, you know, turning up under the bright lights and the high pressure of, you know, competing at the highest level of any sport. And what Hokit is doing this week with these kind of cringy characters that he's playing, and he's basically making this event all about him, you know, going in front of every camera and, you know, doing like a little bit, and, you know, Hokit is drawing a lot of attention to himself is what I'm trying to say. And he's only 8-0. When he sat in the locker room, hey T, you right, boss? Tyson's coming to see us, guys. What's up, my guy? Oh gosh. Okay, we're gonna wrap this one up in a sec, guys, I promise. Alright, Tyson, sit down, bruv. Sit down, my guy. Sit down. There we go. I think he's hungry. We're going to do him some food after I stop rabbiting on about these fights. There you go, my dude. Anyway, what Hokit is doing with all these little bits and things that he's doing throughout this week, all these characters that he's playing, he's drawing attention to himself. And that is going to add a lot more performance anxiety and pressure to Hokit. And so, come Saturday night, when all the talking's done, and he's sat alone in the locker room, warming up, getting ready to go out there and face Blaydes, he's going to be thinking about everything he's done and said this week, and how he's now going out to face the toughest test of his career against a guy who absolutely has the MMA grappling to at least resist Hokit's MMA grappling in the way that Hokit has never experienced in a proper competitive fight before. And your mind can start creeping in with that doubt. The pressure starts to become overwhelming, and it's only very, very, very special athletes that are able to deal with that level of pressure. There are very few fighters that can talk a lot about exactly what they're going to do confidently, cockily go out and do it unfazed. And that's why Ronda, Conor, John Jones, they've become big stars, because they could handle the pressure and the performance anxiety to perform at the highest level when most people can't. And I've got, like I say, direct experience of dealing with this, because in order to produce a profit chart in live betting like this that has spanned 10 years, I've had to become very good at managing performance anxiety and pressure and stress, because the guys in my live betting group, every week when they turn up to live bet with me, they do have that expectation that we're going to make money that night, and that adds a lot of pressure to what I do. So when I'm betting these fights and researching these fights, I do consider the impact that pressure and performance anxiety can have on individual athletes and how that might affect their chances of winning, because it's huge. And we talk about who's the better striker, who's the better grappler, who's younger, who's bigger, all this stuff, but that's kind of something that doesn't usually get considered, but it's potentially one of the biggest factors in determining the outcome of a fight. Usually it's very difficult for us to measure who's dealing with more performance anxiety and pressure coming in, because we don't have access to really get to know how fighters are actually feeling in the run up to a fight, because it's not public, right? They can post stuff on Instagram, say stuff in interviews, but we don't really get to see them on a day-to-day basis. We don't know their finances, what their relationship's like with their family, how their training's gone, what type of personality they've got. But Hokit has very publicly piled a lot of pressure and expectation on himself, which may not be the smartest thing to do this early in his career. Might have been smarter to wait until he got better, more experienced at fighting under the bright lights of the UFC. But with that being said, maybe he knows something we don't. Maybe he's a new unicorn. Maybe he's a future giant star. And maybe he'll live up to expectations and rise to the occasion on Saturday night. What I will say is, when we think about guys over the years who have been able to handle this kind of pressure, there ain't many of them. And so the odds are definitely in Curtis Blaydes' favour, which is why I do think he's a good bet this weekend. I'm just playing the trends. Is Hokit another John Jones? Ronda, Conor can do all these stunts and still perform to his full potential? He probably isn't, but we'll find out on Saturday night. So if we take a look at the over-under on this one, so it is very likely this fight goes to a decision, in my opinion. Like I've already said, neither of these guys are particularly dangerous on the feet. They're more volume strikers. In terms of the spread, yeah, I wouldn't touch that either. I do think it's possible Curtis Blaydes just outclasses Hokit on Saturday night, just because if Hokit can't get his MMA grappling going, Blaydes could just completely outclass him. So yeah, that's how I feel about that one. Hope you found it useful. Let's move on to the next one. Now let's break down the fight between Jiri Procházka and Carlos Ulberg. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds, we can see that they're both in the even money odds range, where if you shop around, to be fair, you can bet them at pretty much the same odds. But here we've got Procházka at a slight favourite, which is minus 119 for an implied probability of 54%. Ulberg 1.96, which is minus 104 for an implied probability of 51%. So I wouldn't expect to see any grappling in this fight. We have seen Jiri use grappling occasionally in his past fights. He took Alex Pereira down a couple times. We saw a lot of grappling from him against Glover Teixeira. But for the most part, we know Jiri likes to stand and bang. And if he hasn't tried to take down strikers like Khalil Roundtree, who were beating him, to be fair, when we know Roundtree's very bad on the ground, I can't imagine he's going to try and take Ulberg down either. And to be fair to Ulberg's takedown offense and ground game looks a lot better than Roundtree's anyway. If we look at the stats, we can see they're both about the same age. They're both about the same size. Jiri slightly longer, Ulberg a little bit taller. And then in terms of the stats, I don't think the stats are all that useful to really put that much weight into with this fight, because again, Jiri has fought a much higher level of opponent than Ulberg. So even though Ulberg has landed 18% more strikes per minute, had he fought the level of opponent that Jiri has, I can't see him being able to maintain that stat. So in terms of how both these two match up from a stylistic point of view, it should be a stand-up fight. In terms of cardio, Ulberg has been known to slow down if you make him work hard. His cardio's held up well in recent fights because he's been able to dictate the pace, but could look very different if Jiri, walks him down, forces him to engage a lot, draws him into a lot of big exchanges and tires him out. I would trust Jiri's cardio more than I would trust Ulberg's, just because Jiri is more battle tested and this is a 5-round fight. And in terms of how they match up when it comes to striking, Ulberg is undoubtedly the more technical striker, but Jiri is unpredictable, difficult to read. He's tough, he's durable, he hits very hard. And he's also one of these guys that has no problem, throwing everything at his opponent and going out on his shield. When he's been losing against Alex Pereira, he's thrown everything at Pereira and got himself knocked out. When he's been losing against Khalil Roundtree, he's thrown everything at Khalil Roundtree, got rocked a few times, but kept coming forward and ultimately knocked Roundtree out in that 3rd round. And so when you look at Ulberg's past fights, they're very neat, they're very tidy, he's very technical, he's in total control, he just chips away at his opponent and, looks very good. Very technical, polished striker. So from a technical point of view, Ulberg is a better striker than Jiri. But Jiri, for me, is more battle-tested. We know he's the kind of guy you have to kill to put away. He can go hard for 5 rounds. If he gets rocked, wobbled, dropped, he's going to keep hanging on in there, and until you actually put him away. He's tough as nails. It's one of those fights where, for me, if I were going to bet one of these two, which I'm not going to, but if I were to bet one of these two, I would rather have money on Jiri, just because he's more proven and we know that you're not just going to be able to chip away at Jiri and win a nice friendly kickboxing match. Jiri was losing to Alexander Rakic and he was also losing to Khalil Roundtree, and in both of those fights, when he started to fall behind, in the second half of those fights, he just cranked it up, went for the kill, threw caution to the wind, and was happy to just get knocked out if it meant that he was going to give it his all. You're not going to outpoint Jiri in a 5-round decision without taking major damage. You either have to knock him out when he comes after you, or outclass him and stay out of trouble for 5 rounds. So with Jiri having that kill or be killed style and that urgency when he recognises that he's losing the fight, I lean heavily towards Jiri here, because I don't know if Ulberg's got that dog in him, and that's often the difference in big high profile title fights such as this. So yeah, my lean is Jiri. Yes, Ulberg is the better striker, the more technical striker, but if making money betting on the UFC was simply about identifying who the more skilled fighter is, we'd all be millionaires, because that's a very easy thing to do. A lot more goes into determining the outcome of fights, and heart, determination, toughness, durability, the will to win. They're major factors, and Jiri has got all of those in great abundance. So as a result, I do lean Jiri on this one. I'm probably not going to be betting this fight, but if you are going to bet this fight, I would prefer to have money on Jiri. Now, in terms of the over-under and the fight spread, I wouldn't touch the fight spread, just because I think personally this fight's more likely to end inside the distance. We've already said Jiri's got that kill or be killed style. At some point he's going to look to take Ulberg out, and in the process either Jiri's going to get knocked out or Ulberg is. And for that reason, I do think this fight is likely to end inside the distance. Unfortunately, the odds are terrible on that. Completely unplayable. So not a lot we can do with the over-under either. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. If you did, please hit the like button below. Subscribe if you haven't already. And if you want me to keep doing these videos, the best way that you can help me keep making these videos is to join my live betting group. It's a no-brainer. The membership will pay for itself, and you can earn money almost every weekend of the year betting on the sport you love. Let me do all the thinking, all the work for you. Just show up on Saturday night, ready to enjoy some fights and ready to make some money and make a profit almost every month of the year. And Lord knows we all need it in these times, because we're all working harder than ever for less than ever. And the great thing about live betting on the UFC is completely immune to whatever's going on in the economy. You don't have to worry about AI taking your jobs. countries getting bombed, gas prices going up. You know, don't need to worry about any of that. You make money almost every month of the year with me in a live betting group. So have a great weekend. I hope to see you in there. If you're watching this, I should see you in there. You know, it's an absolute no-brainer. So love to see you in there on Saturday night. Got any questions, slide by the chat room and let me know. Take care. Have a great weekend. I'll see you in the live betting group. Love you. Bye.